Hello, welcome to another episode of Shine Like a North Star. My name is Carrie Burchell, and I have the pleasure of spending some time with you today to talk about evidence-based work. So when we think of evidence, we often think of like science-y, clinical lab, the kind of work that seems a little bit sterile, if you will. Well, this whole concept of evidence-based research is really catching fire in industries across the nation, across the globe. It doesn't matter if you're in healthcare, which is an obvious one, or if you're, I need to move my microphone here, there you go, or if you are in manufacturing or the police department, there's always evidence that helps us fine-tune the work we're doing. So today's inspiration for the live came from a conversation with a colleague. She works in a healthcare industry, and she was asked to do some evidence-based research prior to going into a Kaizen, which is like a week-long problem-solving, really deep dive with the right people in the room to figure out what we need to do next to fix whatever the problem is. So she gets asked in advance can you please just give us some research around the topic that we're doing the Kaizen on? So she went ahead and did the research. Well, lo and behold, the Kaizen is normally 5 days long because of the research that she was able to provide and how it guided the group in figuring out how they could streamline the problem and fix it, get rid of waste, all the things that were driving people crazy about the problem. It went from a 5-day Kaizen to 4 days. Yeah. That's how much the research cut down all of the work. So if you think there were maybe 20 people involved in the Kaizen, you take all of their salary, times it by a day, and you've got a chunk of money because one person slowed down to do a little bit of evidence-based research before going into the event. Pretty compelling stuff. So when we think of evidence-based work, what you want to do first is define the question. So what do you need to understand better? So that can be everything from how do I use my Outlook calendar more effectively to, how do we improve this health outcome, to better processes to ensure the quality of something that you're manufacturing, to customer service, parenting, right? So really get clear on what your question is first. And that will help you sort of get from the big, wide universe of research out there to this very focused scope. So you want to define the question. Then, of course, as you can gather evidence, right? Evidence-based research. So you're pulling in all of the stuff related to your specific question because you can kind of have what we call scope creep, and it gets broad. Be disciplined to keep it narrow. And after that, you're going to assess the credibility of those sources. So, anybody can make a web page and sort of proclaim to know the shortcuts of the calendar. Well, what have actually people done, and what's the evidence that what they've done has worked, right? So you want to assess the sources for being credible. It's not enough that just people are slapping stuff up there. And then you want to sort of apply what the evidence tells you to your circumstance. So you don't screen the evidence based on your circumstance. You get best practice, best evidence out there, call it for the credibility, and then apply what applies to your case. Because the reason why you do it that way is you don't want to rule out some evidence that may actually help you adjust or tweak what you're doing. Sometimes if you go in like too narrow, then you're not seeing other possibilities. Because sometimes when we apply evidence to real cases, we can see how we actually need to do something totally different or a significant adjustment to what we're doing. If we go in to sort of do what we're doing but better, it keeps us in way too narrow of a space. So you want to say like, how do I fix X? Or, what do we know about Y? Keep the content wide. And after you have the evidence, then sort of apply it to what your question is, if that makes sense. Then you want to assess the outcomes, right? So you apply the evidence, work it for a while, see what happens, and then sort of say, okay, dust is settling. Now what do we know about the evidence that we've gathered? And how does that inform our evidence-based thinking moving forward? Does that make sense? So really thinking about the question, gathering evidence broadly without bias, right? And I see this is, number 2 is really the sticker where people get hung up. I see out of COVID, the last year or two, people really trying to gather evidence that justifies doing things the same way that we did like 5 years ago. And it's really like, that doesn't cut it. So you want to think broadly, like be self-conscious of your biases and how you're sort of managing that. So you want to gather evidence that's going to inform your problem, not just inform how you do it, if that makes sense. This is part of the bottleneck that I see many of the clients that I'm supporting get stuck in, is right. They want to gather data that justifies how they're doing it. It's not out there, right? The other thing that I see happening around the second point there is that there isn't a magic pill to sort of figure out how to do things now. Short-staffed, the supply chain being messy, people are not wanting to work in the same environments that they wanted to before. Like there's a lot of competing variables right now that make leadership difficult. And we're not embracing this idea of how do we grow people? How do we help them lean into whatever that space is? There's not a magic answer. There's not a very clean algorithm for how we should do things in the evidence, because we don't know. And so when you gather evidence and it's broadly about the question you're asking, then you're opening yourself up to different puzzle pieces that you can kind of grab and create your own puzzle. Because there isn't sort of a recipe out there for how to respond to the variables that we're facing right now. There's nuggets, and you want to grab those nuggets and make your own puzzle, if you will, those puzzle pieces. So number 2 is important, how you, like the way you gather information and just managing your bias, that emotional intelligence. Then of course, assess the source. So wipe out those ones that aren't credible, apply it to your question, right? Start implementing and start then assessing how the outcomes are. I hope this is helpful when we think about assessing the outcome, defining the question, gathering evidence, and applying it. So I would love to hear about what's happening in your world when we think about shining like a North Star, and feel free to check me out. I have resources on my website, and would just love to hear about your journey of innovation and using evidence, because people want to think their opinion is more valid than the evidence. Right? So there's some leadership work around getting buy-in to slow down and look at the evidence and really get granular about how we can leverage the evidence to cut back a day of work, like it was for that Kaizen that I started with when we opened today's live on Shine Like a North Star. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week.